the October meetup for the Adelaide Microsoft IT Pro Community User Group. I'm Andrew Young, one of the hosts, and I've got Matt Klein with me. Brett, I assume, will join us, unless you've heard otherwise, Matt. You do. Okay.
Wow. Okay. How long have I been doing this for? Okay, so I was muted. I just assume that Brett's just generally flaky. No, he's not. I'm sure he's got a good reason.
He'll chime in when he comes without us knowing. Cool. So it's about housekeeping. We acknowledge the land that we meet on today. That is the traditional lands for the Kaurna people, and that we respect the spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge that the Kaurna people, as the custodians of the Adelaide region, and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. We also pay respects to the cultural authority of Aboriginal people visiting, attending from other areas of South Australia and Australia. So what's new? If you hadn't heard yet, it's Windows 11 Day. So as soon as the clock strikes midnight in your region, you'll be able to get it. It's also the 7th anniversary of the Windows Insider program. So Ninja Cat, some of you may remember from the early days.
Yeah, it's funny. Like I was expecting to have like a day one patch type thing for all my Windows 11 devices because I am who I am. I've got Windows 11 running on literally everything. I don't have. In fact, it feels weird now going back to Windows 10 because I've got Windows 11 running on everything now. So I was expecting a gigantic day one patch though, which I don't know why. Maybe I just play too many games. That's the problem.
I mean, it's been an insider preview, so I guess those were the day negative patches.
Yeah.
It's also the non-subscription version of our Office. So if you're into that kind of thing, it's got the same kind of rounded corners and the fluent color design behind it. It's only got a few of the features that you may see from the 365 version of the apps. So you won't get stuff like the presenter coach in PowerPoint, for example, and get some stuff like modern formulas in Excel, and that's about it. But yeah, they've got some different plans for the student home and the small office. But if you're still running a non-365 version, there you go.
This was one that kind of took me by surprise, I've got to admit, because I had been told by many, many people that 2019 was the absolute last MSI version, bar none, the end, close the book, we're not doing it anymore, shut the door, it's all over, it's all, the click to run after this, there will be no more. So and I don't remember hearing a lot about this either as, an upcoming thing. There wasn't a lot of chatter about it, or maybe I'm just not listening to the right people.
I only heard about it a couple of weeks back. It was very low key.
It's been in you've been able to select it from the Office config tool. So it's been in there for quite a while.
Right.
But it's the way that I like to position it, just to kick things off, is anytime there's a new perpetual release, it will be incredibly underwhelming to anyone who's already using a subscription version.
Very cool.
Because it's stuff that you may have already had for 2 or 3 years.
Yep.
Yeah. It's also time for some new Surface for Business devices. A lot of these are rolling out today as well, but there's only some that are purchasable from the States or through a reseller. So reach out to your resellers if you've got any. So it's obviously the Surface Pro lines and 8th gen. So you got a slightly bigger touchscreen, smaller bezel. I think there's now 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports. So we're seriously lacking in the port space previously. 11th gen Intel chips and roughly 16 hours of battery. Very big exclamation mark next to that. The new contender, if it comes up, I've lost focus, sorry. Surface Laptop Studio. So they've done some merging of the laptop and the studio itself. into something that looks a bit like that. So this comes in an i5 and i7 variant. The i7 variant actually comes with an RTX 3050 Ti in it. So into gaming, that might work. It's got an SSD that goes up to 2 terabytes. So it's a contender, but we'll have to see what the early adopters say.
Yeah, it's funny. I've been a big fan of the Surface Book for a long time. I had one of the original ones, and I always try and get them wherever possible. In fact, my main work machine is a Book 3. I absolutely love them. So this is, I guess, the exact replacement for what the Book is or was. So yeah, I think the hingy foldy downy action that's going on there is interesting, because it means I don't have to take the whole screen off, turn it around, and then put it into being like, if I need to do anything with the pen and want it laying flat. So I kind of look at it and go, yeah, that's kind of looks cool, but there's a lot going on there. So I would be very interested to try it to see how much of a difference there is from, I guess, my workflows, which are not overly creative. I have the drawing capabilities of a sloth that's had a head injury. So there's not a lot going on there for me from a drawing point of view, but I do use it for note taking and stuff like that. And so it being able to go flat straight away is kind of handy for me. But yeah,
it's not
an interesting one.
Keyboard pressing or anything where you've got it disappears, and it just needs to come up like the sound effect for the transformers when you change tablet mode.
Yeah.
The Surface Go line, that's the much smaller. So they've actually got newer CPUs, obviously, and they're claiming that the i3 now has 60% or so better performance. So I expect they've got some good battery life on them as well. The Duo 2, so that's got a later release date. So it's got a new camera setup. So I think there's 3 cameras in the array. Supports 5G if the carrier supports them, I think. There's also a bar on the hinges. So it's got I think they call it glance bar. So you can see the notifications come up just without opening it up. I don't think the first gen had any of that kind of stuff. Not that we could even get it here.
I think everyone would agree was fairly underwhelming from a hardware internals point of view. There was no NFC in the original one as well, which was really tough, because it meant that you didn't have contactless payments and stuff like that. And so, at the time, not a huge deal, but COVID kind of changed a lot of that, and it would have become a massive deal. So I think they've upped the internals to be, at the right level for a flagship device. It is pretty heavily around the bezels still, but look, I'd absolutely love to try one of these out. I think that the concept of them with the dual screens and the fold out without it being one screen that folds down the middle like the Samsungs or the others that do that is a really, really good idea. But I think they've covered off a lot of the stuff that was missing from the first gen.
I think there was a small mention on the Surface Pro X. I believe they've introduced a Wi-Fi only version that's slightly cheaper. I think that's about it for the Surface stuff. Next up, do you use the Whiteboard app? There's been a massive update to the Whiteboard, and just showing you this picture is probably doesn't do it justice. So switch to that. I'll drop this link in the. That didn't work, did it? No. How's that? So the blog came out last week. I actually accidentally came across the Whiteboard and saw, there's some stuff on the left-hand side now. I just thought nothing of it, and then yeah, I saw this blog came out, and there's a lot of stuff that's been going on behind the scenes here. So templates, sticky notes, you can do shapes that can now autocorrect. So it's like smart inking. You got arrows from your lines. You can hold shift and you can make straight lines. So that's probably going to help a lot of people like Matt with their drawing skills.
Yeah.
And that's awesome. Like just on the fly.
I really like the whiteboard app. I use it on so I've got an iPad that I use for basically in meetings as well. And part of my workflow on that is to be able to on the fly be able to do a guess when there isn't literally a whiteboard in the room, is to be able to draw out what I would be drawing on a whiteboard on the iPad with the pen. And I use it a lot on my Surface Book as well. So these have been some massively good changes for me, especially because, as I said, the sloth with a head injury creativity level of me is not helping anyone. So I think it's fantastic. I've been using it for a little while. I've got the insider preview for some of the other apps, and yeah, it's really, really good. Really good. If you're not using it, highly recommend at least having a look at it. If you've got like a device with a pen, it's fantastic. It really is just great. It also syncs obviously through either to your work account or your personal account as well, and has all the integrations that you'd expect from that as well. So you can kind of keep going, save your whiteboards. It's not just something that kind of lives in Teams. It's obviously, there you go, there's the Teams bit, but it also does a whole heap of stuff for just if you just want to jot down stuff as well. So really good.
The Windows Store app and I believe the iOS app, they're both they're rolling out. We've had a look today with some other people, but yeah, it's so far it seems like it's the whiteboard within Teams has gotten the new stuff, and I expect within the quarter we should have it in desktop and iOS at a minimum. Oh yeah, that's cool. We had little cursors on who's who, and
yeah, there's a lot of really good stuff in there. So
switch back to the slides. Okay, so new exams, AZ 800 and 801. Finally, we're getting some server certifications again. Very heavily skewed to the hybrid side of things, but you're going to be expected to be able to do management, troubleshooting, securing of everything within on-prem, hybrid, and cloud only. You guys heard any more on this?
I haven't. So this is another one that kind of snuck up on me as well. I hadn't heard that this was coming. I think it's been a gap in the certification area since the
new role
on-prem stuff and all the new role stuff. And while there's probably some double up around the Azure admin stuff, that's more the Azure admin one's more actually managing an Azure tenant and subscription rather than managing the IaaS component. So I think in this part, it's a lot better focused around what sysadmins are doing, because we're not at a point where we're getting rid of servers. Regardless of where they live, we are still at a point where I think this is very much needed still, and it's good to see it come back, or not come back, but to be there.
Yeah, so that, I think the beta period had just ended, so that'll be available in December onwards. Another one to scratch up. So there's some important dates. We touched on that last time, but Legacy Auth or Basic Auth or something is getting turned off properly this time.
So they're threatening. I think they're threatening it again now. October 2022. This is actually a really, really, really big change for app integration more than anything else. And it's around the Outlook or the exchange protocols of SMTP, IMAP, POP3, ActiveSync as well. So You can control this through conditional access policies if you want to start getting ahead of this. On the way I've done it in the past is I've put a conditional access policy to disable legacy auth for user accounts in a tenancy, because that still lets service accounts and applications still churn away using legacy auth in the background. And AAD also has a whole heap of reports that you can pull on who's using legacy auth. So you start improving the security posture immediately, even before you're required to do so, and then you can start remediating those applications and working with vendors to get the versions that actually use modern auth. The areas that I personally have found where it's been the biggest challenge has actually been like scripts which are calling and using basic auth for their authentication back into the service, has been the biggest challenge to get them cut over to being using modern auth as well. So yeah, it's coming in, a year. You've got 12 months. I would say that 12 months is going to go quickly. So start planning, because there's the potential of it being quite disruptive, especially around the applications. Like, I know a very, 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 very large application that is used that is not modern auth capable. And at the time when I was working in that particular tenant, it was a pretty big problem at the time. So hopefully all of the vendors are kind of taking this and taking it a little bit more seriously and working towards that, getting modern auth into their apps well and truly before October next year, so that people can actually start, road mapping what those upgrades look like, if they do need upgrades, or whether they're SaaS-based stuff. So yeah, it's going to be fun.
Yeah. Sell. All right. I don't know if they've changed the date for this one yet as well, but the unlimited archive feature or the auto-expanding archive for your online archive, they're trying to limit that to a maximum of 1.5 terabytes across all your online archives. It's also you can't just keep giving away free storage, I guess, but I think there are people taking advantage of it, just funneling or journaling mail into a shared mailbox, and it's not really kosher with the compliance licensing as well. So it's also not really designed for that. So they'll be throttling the up or the intake to 1 gig per day, I think, into an archive mailbox. So just keep that in mind. Of course, if you got retention periods, you'd be getting rid of stuff you don't need after a certain time anyway. And if you need journaling, you'd look for a proper journaling solution. Next month, we've got it's the fall version of the Ignite online event. So registration's open. So head on over to myignite.microsoft.com.
Yeah, I think we'll see a slowdown of announcements now from Microsoft around this, as they just start basically sandbagging until Ignite, because they need something to, some stuff to announce there, because obviously Windows 11 was probably the big thing. So yeah.
It'll be things like, this is what you can do in Windows 11.
Yeah,
give them a bit of content to work with.
I wouldn't be surprised if the Android integration in Windows 11 came through in Ignite, or there was at least an announcement on the availability for it.
Okay, so that's not at launch, is it?
No, it's not at launch. It's not even in the Insider through dev previews yet.
Right.
That piece hasn't been turned on yet.
Okay, probably and hopefully. So that looks like one of the really cool things coming from it. Just some learning resources. So your 30 days to learn it ranges from Azure to Power Platform. Complete a learning path in 30 days and you get a 50% voucher to take an exam. There's also the virtual training days. They're on all the time. They cover the fundamental courses, so you can get a free exam out of doing or attending one of those days. Certification renewal. If you haven't already gotten an email, and if you've done an exam in the past and you've passed a certificate, you should get an email by now from anytime after June saying, head on over to your learning profile and take an assessment. So this becomes available from 6 months before your expiry. So it's, my experience was 20 questions. I went through the learning path again just to brush up on knowledge, and it's there and done, and it gives you another year from the original expiry date. So you're just really sitting it every year rather than taking an exam every 2 years and paying for an exam. So it's a free renewal. So good times. And keep an eye out on the certifications poster. They'll surely add the new exams to that was just mentioned before. But that's an awesome resource if you haven't seen it before. What's next? Don't know. We had some internal chats, but yeah, if the audience has any burning desire for anything particular, send it through to us, leave it in the chat, and we'll put something together. Anything more from you, Matt? We'll just jump straight into it.
No, let's kick it off.
All right. So, talking about Intune this month and more the troubleshooting side of things, because that's always a hot topic and highly desirable by our audience. So we've got a panel of guest speakers with us today. So we've got Robert Crane. I'm sure most of you have seen or met Robert before. He delivers a lot of M365 training, both sales and tech oriented. He runs the CIAOPS, and he's a Microsoft MVP and MCT. If there's anything he'd like to say or add to that?
That sounds good to me.
No. We've also got Mark O'Shea. So he's over in Sydney as well as a consultant, also MVP and MCT. Like to say anything, Mark?
Oh, no, that's perfect for me as well.
Yep.
Yeah.
Cool. So, and we've also got Will Wakelin, who is actually owner, I guess, or partner, V-CIO and consultant, all the hats at a new business, Hivemind Solutions. You want to go through any of that with us, Will?
No, that's pretty much on it at the moment.
No, don't want to do any shameless plugging of you.
Well, I figured the plugging can come later since I specialize in Intune.
All right. Well, get rid of the slides. Get you all to turn on your cameras and get it going. Robert, the camera shy.
No, I'm just wondering what's the context. So, I mean, do you want us to, share our best practices or share, thoughts from the field, or what's the, what do you feel is the way to get it started?
Yeah, I've got a few questions. So essentially, I'll go around the room, the virtual room. We'll start with yourself, I guess. So Robert, what is Intune or the MEM, Microsoft Endpoint Manager? What is it to you in your day-to-day and in your line of work? How's it helped and all that?
Well, I think at the end of the day, the idea is that we can't configure most workstations the traditional way using a policy from a domain controller, because our machines live all over the place. And with the remote work from home issue and challenges, that brings a unique requirement to be able to configure these devices wherever and whenever they are. Doing and using Endpoint Manager and Intune allows you to effectively take those policies and deploy them to machines wherever they might be. And again, the trend is largely, especially driven by, I suppose, SMB, but also the larger businesses now, that is the preferred option to be able to deploy, manage, update those from a single web console, no matter where the machines actually rely. And it does still bring, the same challenges with group policy, as in there are lots of settings, lots of options. But I would point out that Microsoft has now provided us with a number of baselines, and we can see that growing. So you can certainly start with the baselines as a good point to make sure you're locked down and you're adhering to, Essential 8 and those sort of things, and then work back from there. The negative probably is that Intune is still a product and endpoint manager, still a product under development as it has been for all its life. So it does still require a fair amount of knowledge and getting your hands dirty. It will do exactly what you want, but there can be a steep and frustrating learning curve when many of the settings do turn up in multiple locations and can cause a lot of frustration. So I think that it's very, very powerful in what it does, but it's still an environment where you do have to invest the time and come with a good discipline around policies and the way you implement it rather than just randomly throwing it together. So I use it every day. I use it on all the workstations. I recommend it to everybody. Handles cloud PCs. It handles Windows 365, every sort of device I've seen. But again, to get to that point where you do have a standard set of policies you apply that adhere to your standards can be a bit challenging. And at the end of the day, I think it comes down to a good discipline and documentation because unfortunately, like I said, the product is a bit unwieldy when it comes to the options that are available to you.
Yes, just a follow-up question onto that. You kind of touched on the group policy side of this, and I'd be interested to hear everyone's opinion on what the evolution is. Like, obviously, Intune is the way that Microsoft kind of wants us to go. What does that transition look like from someone who's managing in a SCCM world and a GPO world? What does this look like for them? Like, what's their first step into this wide new world of what is, I want to just label it as cloud management, or the cloud version of SCCM. What does that look like for those SCCM and GPO admins out there who are looking to transition through to Intune?
Well, I'd suggest that what you need to think about is you need to think about your fleet. Some of them will stay where they are, managed as they are with GPOs, and again, but I think a subsection of that, which may be remote workers, it may be field staff or whatever, the transition would be to use those as totally cloud managed. You can do hybrid where you mix GPOs and Intune together, but it becomes difficult to determine where the line of GPOs end and Intune starts. So my experience would recommend that you're better off setting aside a community of devices to be totally cloud managed and then looking at moving more devices sort of into that community over time.
And with that, I guess, how does it handle the conflict, or any conflicts between when you're starting to onboard devices into Intune and starting to apply Intune-based policies over those GPOs, where you've got a GPO applying and now you've got a Intune policy applying? Where does the demarcation point sit? Which one's going to win in those sort of situations?
Probably more a question for Mark than me, but I think this is one of the challenges with the environment is unfortunately, policies are not necessarily pushed down in sequence or in order or in priority. They depend on what they do, how long they are, how long they take to implement. So you could push down a policy that's very, very short, but if it's disk encryption, for example, that disk encryption could take a long time before it completes and is happy with that as a policy. So the easy answer is that it depends because there are so many variables here. So I think one of the real secrets of success of any sort of endpoint management going forward is to keep it as simple as possible, move forward in small steps and keep good documentation, because unfortunately, if you do get lost in the woods and you haven't dropped breadcrumbs, you are probably going to end up in the big bad wolf's house. It's quite a challenging area when you have, again, got too far down the track potentially, and you're trying to work out where issues may lie.
Okay. So yeah, I'll jump in. So if you've got policies conflicting between group policy and Intune, you're doing it wrong. Now, it's not to say that it won't happen because someone's messed up somewhere, but you really shouldn't be targeting the same policies through both. And even better, you shouldn't be targeting similar categories of policies across both. So if I stick to Rob's example of BitLocker, for example, you're not going to choose a handful of BitLocker settings from group policy and then a handful of settings, hopefully non-conflicting settings from Intune. Instead, you just make a decision, where are we going to manage this particular workload? So split everything down into workloads. Now, in some cases, I guess where you can run into some issues there where people don't realize, or someone might jump into your GPO environment and say, why aren't these machines getting BitLocker policies applied to them? And it's like, well, it is. It's just not that. It's just that that's where it's not happening. So going back to Rob's thing around making sure things are documented, and the thing here is, and once you start throwing in things like, so let's throw in some config manager admin alongside Azure AD admin, alongside Intune admin, alongside your GPO admin. One of the big challenges that you're going to have there is making sure that, first of all, that people don't step on each other's toes. And a lot of the time it's not going to be deliberate, but everyone needs to be aware of, like, especially, and I think probably Azure AD, or actually identity in general, is probably where some of this is going to occur, where people don't realize that whatever they're changing is going to have a flow-on effect into the cloud environment, for example. But just in terms of policies, you can pick which one you want to override, so that way you could have a GPO setting win over in the Intune setting. But then, as Rob mentioned, if you've got overlapping policies on the Intune side, so if you've got a handful of policies in Intune that are trying to configure BitLocker again, then that's where you just need to take a step back and say, okay, let's put them all into one location. Now, what location is it? It's really up to you. If you've got an organization where people are going to be, where there is actually somebody whose role is basically, I am the person who is responsible for security in the org, including securing devices, then that would be where things like the baseline security policies in Intune would be a good place to do that. So what it means is that over time, you might have to start stripping existing policies out of one location, even in Intune or the endpoint manager console, and then bring it into another portion there. And this is probably one of the issues that I wrestle with quite a bit at the moment. Is you look at an environment that's working and you go, I could just tidy it up a little bit. I could pull these things out of that legacy policy, or worst case scenario. How many of you have still got things in custom CSPs that that are in custom policies that don't need to be in a custom policy any longer? I've got way more than I'd care to admit, but I'm looking at it going, I know what they are, it's documented, it's not going to cause a problem, but realistically, anything that Intune is doing natively or Endpoint Manager Console is doing natively, we probably should be looking at some point trying to transition across to the latest and greatest way of doing it, just to make sure that we're not in that situation that we ended up with in group policy, where people were terrified to touch anything because they didn't know what the impact was going to be. And I've already seen that in a few Intune environments where it's like, why on earth are these different? So BitLocker, so they weren't conflicting bit or overlapping / conflicting policies for BitLocker, for example, but different sets of devices being targeted through different admin UIs, which it's just more of a point in time thing that they probably should have, gone back and said, let's just duplicate the old settings in the new location rather than having them floating around in multiple places.
Just on that, I mean, the Microsoft best practice really is to create pilot groups for this kind of thing and create a roadmap approach, especially, it's odd to say this, but it is an easier approach if you do have Configuration Manager co-managed in there, because you can set up the nice conversion across to the Intune-based policies from an SCCM base or group policy. Whereas if you're going purely to Intune from a traditional AD environment, as someone mentioned in the comments, it's sometimes easier to start thinking of, I'm going to have my servers managed by a group policy, Active Directory, that sort of stuff, yet my fleet's going to be managed entirely through Intune and the newer Azure AD stuff.
So it sounds like a really good opportunity for people as they go through this path to rationalize what they're doing with their endpoint management right now, whether that be, in how they're managing it through GPO or in SCCM, and really taking stock and looking at what they're doing now and then doing a logical shift into Intune and the movements around that. What are some ways that people can get started, I guess? What are the sort of the gotchas, really, of getting that rationalization in place?
Well, probably like a good area would be finding out, like as you're going through and looking for, like checking to see what group policy objects aren't supported or settings aren't supported that you're currently using, identifying, do you actually need them? So if you start getting a whole bunch of things like red stop sign icons popping up saying you've got all of these policies that won't migrate to, or that you can't implement in Intune, if it's things like IE6 or IE7 settings that nobody has updated or removed, since they stopped being useful. So in a lot of cases, you might find that some of the things that are there don't, they're just old, they're decrepit, they should be pulled out. So they're pretty easy decisions. But you'll probably, and especially in a larger environment, it's almost guaranteed that you're going to find some things that maybe aren't things that the combination of, it's not necessarily Intune, it's going to be a combination of Windows 10, what it supports through MDM, etc., in combination with Intune. And sometimes if the solution is just getting a little bit too creative, for some organizations, they're probably just going to stay with group policy, at least for those particular settings. So maybe they need to stick on the hybrid Azure AD joined path for a bit longer. But my recommendation for a lot of these things is just sort of, especially for orgs that are really cautious, is start off with things that even if you break them, it doesn't really matter. Or I shouldn't say that matters, but if I'm putting in something in place such as, let's start off with something where, like, let's apply the sign-in screen wallpaper through Intune. So that is something that, yes, someone might notice that the sign-in screen looks a little bit different if the policy doesn't work, but it's not going to break anything in there. So so there are certain things that you can start off with just by picking and choosing some things that I'd say would be low business impact if they went horribly wrong. And at least that way you learn a bit about targeting the users, targeting the devices, seeing how people react when they do see some of those changes, and then start pushing a bit further. And even in some cases, anyone who's got as soon as Config Manager becomes part of the conversation, it's like, I don't want to say you will never see a Config Manager environment go to pure Intune, but it's highly unlikely that they would go to Intune. They've got Config Manager because they need Config Manager. Maybe some of its historical uses aren't going to be as important moving forward, but they're still going to keep it because they know how to do, zero-touch OS installs from scratch when a machine, when a drive needs to be replaced. People who've got a whole bunch of apps packaged up in Config Manager, there's no magic button that automatically converts them across to Intune apps. So on the Config Manager side, I throw that one into a bit of a different category, because that's where, if someone's invested in Config Manager and somebody has Config Manager skills, I just find it highly unlikely that that person is going to be in any great rush to get rid of Config Manager. And I view it as a very different conversation to an Exchange admin trying to keep Exchange on-prem. It's not that same kind of, this is what I know, I want to keep it. Like, we're talking about something that's got completely different functionality in some areas to what Intune has got.
Got some hands up.
Okay.
So my quick comment also is to think about this outside the Windows environment, right? So remember that Intune and Endpoint Manager now give you the capability to manage devices that were never, ever able to be managed by group policy, being iOS, Android, iPads, the so on. So there's another group or community that you could start with. You could say, right, we're going to start managing everybody's mobile devices, which never were on group policy, would never fall under anything that we've had before. So let's create new policies, roll them out to these mobile devices, and then look at bringing in the Windows 10 and whatnot from there. So that's another approach that you could take.
Funnily enough, I've actually just migrated a customer from a Config Manager environment to pure Intune. The process was very much what we were talking about before, which is creating pilot groups, slowly moving everything across, finding what did and didn't work, and then eventually getting to the point where it was a okay, now we're fully in Intune. And as Robert also mentioned, just then starting off with Android and iOS devices.
Is that the gateway drug into Intune, the MDM component, or is it the Windows side?
I think I was going to say, I think it depends largely on the audience that you've got, right? But I think if you're looking for the least impact to the business and the greatest impact on security, then I would say mobile devices, iOS and Android.
Yeah, I'd agree. Part of my focus is on Android devices, and being able to manage them in a more complete manner is, it's just so useful for most enterprises.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of where Intune had its roots, really, was around that MDM component, and then expanded out through into the Windows component where we're seeing it now. Or should we be calling it Microsoft Endpoint Manager, MEM. Where I think we've covered off a lot of the Windows component. Is there a good starting point for, speaking of the MDM component? What's the logical starting point for this? Is it just get some devices in there and start having a play, for lack of a better word, and using some of those baselines, or
even just use VMs? If you don't have devices, just fire up some Windows VMs and you're good to go.
When you're talking about Android and iOS, same thing. Just enroll them in. It's pretty easy to do. You can do it on your personal devices without any real risk of losing anything with the company portal app. It's a really good place to start playing around, inflicting policies upon yourself, and seeing what sort of data you're collecting and how the reporting out of your user base could look.
Another approach you can take is to do the BYOD focus. So you can say, right, no MDM, we're just going to do MAM, and we're just going to do that on remote devices to start off with, because what I find is most company security, most companies, CIOs and CEOs are most concerned about their information being accessible by contractors or people working from home without protection. So MAM is a good way to do that without the need to enroll devices and Azure AD join. And typically, if you do that on mobile devices first, they haven't been subject to any policies as yet. And then from there, you can then do MAM with Windows 10 and then look at doing MDM. So you've got lots of options to choose from. It just depends on the appetite of the organization, how quickly they want to implement that control versus where they are at this point in time. So there are ways that you can implement it on devices that have never seen any policy applied that will improve their security, and that is going to be a step in the right direction.
And that also lends itself towards the zero trust stuff that's going on right now.
Yeah, and I mean, my mind immediately came to like session-based policies in MCAS at that point as well, around external trusts and, external sharings and all of the good stuff that MCAS does. I mean, it's a rich tapestry at that point of, what you want to stop people doing within which product and where it comes across and where it's appropriate. The question I was going to pose as well to you guys is around the security piece. Like, obviously, and to deviate a little bit from the pure MEM side of it, is the conditional access component, and we sort of touched on the Azure AD piece. What's that component look like? What's the underlying bits that you've really got to, before you get into Intune or MEM from a cloud-based piece, what other pieces do you need to make sure that you've got right in your tenancy, not necessarily on-prem from a config manager piece? Those SCCM, those MDE, the MDEs, the MCASs, the everything else that Microsoft got. What's the bit that you want to make sure you got nailed before you turn it on? Do these things first.
Okay, so I'll happily jump into this one. Anyone who jumps into this stuff without any Azure AD knowledge is setting themselves up for disaster. So if you think about so across any of the M365 services and across, I guess, just Azure in general, trying to approach things without knowing how to work with identity is going to be a problem. So making sure that that you're familiar with how conditional access works. Yes, that assumes you've got an Azure AD premium license, which I'm going to assume everyone does. And the reason why I make that assumption is because the year is 2021 and there's no excuse not to. There may be people who disagree with that, but
yeah,
I'm not willing to listen to anyone's argument on that, because I believe I'm right.
If you license for Intune, are you? And I'm not a licensing guy. Licensing hurts my brain. Like I refuse to touch it.
No, we're not talking about licensing. We're talking about having the capabilities of a product available to a user. Very different conversation to licensing.
If you've got Intune from a licensing point of view, like you're paying for Intune, does that include AADP1 as well?
No. Okay, so let me. So look, I'll jump in.
Yeah. Okay, there we go.
So there was a good chunk of, so let's say between the years maybe 2012 to 2014. Actually, I think 2014 is probably correct, I think. During that time, you would have a standalone Intune conversation because that's how you bought Intune. But probably like sometime early 2014, that's when EMS was introduced. So, and the good thing there was you didn't have to have, here's what Intune gives you and here's what you get if you add Azure AD Premium to the mix. So as soon as EMS was available, you could just say, Office 365 plus EMS gives you these capabilities, which was a much easier conversation. Because if someone tried to pull it out and say, I just want to talk about Intune, that's like, well, I'm not going to talk to you about Intune because there'll be a bunch of things you'll say, what about this, this, and this? And I'll say, well, that's not device management or application management. That's identity or that's information protection. So EMS made that whole thing a lot easier. And probably and with M365, that's made or I guess as long as you're looking at M365 Business Premium or higher, nice little, there is a licensing element to that piece for sure. But as soon as you talk about that, then there's a good baseline in terms of the Intune being part of it, Azure AD Premium being part of it. So you can have a conversation without someone sort of necessarily saying, what about this or that? Now, there are still going to be people who've only got Office 365. And it's like, yes, you only have Office 365. It's one of the three components that's in Microsoft 365. So there's stuff that you are not going to have unless you go out and upgrade to M365 or add the random components that you need. So that's a conversation that's gotten a lot easier because just trying to have an Intune conversation, it was never a winning strategy because people wanted to have more than an MDM or application management conversation. So that piece is a lot easier without sort of having to get into premium P1 versus premium P2 options or anything like that. That's definitely made that that whole I guess the licensing conversation in general a lot easier.
And not to digress too much from that, but when they did move it from Intune to Microsoft Endpoint Manager, when you were using Microsoft 365 Business Premium and up, you were then entitled to your CALs for Configuration Manager because, of course, Endpoint Manager also is Configuration Manager. They're the same product now.
So rounding that out, so you need conditional access. You need to be familiar with AAD. Where's the starting point? Are we from a device point of view? Should you be hybrid joining your devices first before you start looking at onboarding them into Intune, or should you be doing I know, and believe me, I try to avoid config manager and endpoint manager as much as humanly possible. In fact, I try hard not to even be able to spell them. I guess I know that there's the function of once you've hybrid joined something, you can automatically onboard it into Intune or the other way around. So
even that automatic enrollment. So that's one of the main reasons why Azure AD Premium needs to be part of that conversation. So that's why I'd always try to shift it away from like an Intune conversation up to EMS, because then that means that there's less things that go wrong in terms of them saying, but this didn't work or that didn't work. But in terms of hybrid, like I wouldn't necessarily start off with hybrid unless AD joined was important to you in the mid to long term. If it's something where you've got a strategy for reducing your reliance on your on-prem infrastructure over time, then just sort of pick groups of people who, like, it's a lot easier today than it was a year and a half ago, but pick groups of people who work remotely almost if not completely entirely. So people who never really had fast direct line of sight to a domain controller, for example. So they'd always be fantastic users or devices to target for a pure MDM approach. And that way you can just sort of get to see what works, what doesn't work. And it's, maybe it's just as you're rolling out a few new systems to people as you're replacing the current fleet. But the downside of that approach, though, is it means that you've got to manage the old way of doing things and the new way of doing things. So whether that means that you're the person who's responsible for it, that means there's two different environments you need to manage, or two different skill sets you need to have. But then the other part of that, you have to think about when it's time to replace the person who's currently performing that task. Are you going to be able to find someone quickly at an affordable rate who can actually manage on-prem and cloud? And I think pretty much all of you probably know that it's hard to find people at the best of times with one skill, let alone, like I know people who've got really good AD skills, and I know people who've got really good Intune skills, and the Venn diagram, that overlapping section is getting smaller and smaller. And the other thing that's also important with that one, especially if you're trying to keep on-prem AD around, or let's ignore the on-prem AD, let's say group policy stuff, is Windows is a really small percentage of devices that will end up being managed by Intune or Endpoint Manager, because you'll have Windows, you'll have Mac OS, and Windows will be big winner in most orgs there. But as soon as you throw in your Android and iOS devices, then Windows might end up with 25 to 30% share of your environment. So getting people familiar with how MDM works is kind of it's a universal skill that applies to those OSs and any other OSs that Microsoft decides that they can do MDM management via Intune. Whereas imagine bringing somebody on board today. So you just sort of hire someone new, they're fresh, they're enthusiastic, they've grown up in the cloud, and you sit them down and go, this is where we start working with group policy in Windows Server. And they'll be saying, they'll go, I've never seen a server before. Are these the things that are in the cloud? So you've got to think of the skill, you've got to think about the skill set there. And like, it's not that AD skills are going away, but it's more that it's at that point where somebody who's getting into IT today, it's probably not the thing that it's not the thing that they're excited about. It's not the thing that they want to learn more about. They don't want to be a Windows Server admin. They don't want to be a server admin, full stop.
I don't blame them. I wouldn't want to be a server admin either.
Yeah.
And I guess I guess part of that is also, and we spoke about this before, and I'll get to your statement in or question in just a tick, is following on from Will. My question following that will be, we know that you can't manage servers in Intune. Is it still the best place to, obviously that's the demarcation point for now. The on-prem management is GPO and SCCM, and that's your on-prem servers, and everything else in an ideal world should be going to Intune.
Yeah, so I guess, like for the server side, I guess if people wanted to go more cloud management side, especially on the security side, then maybe like enrolling your VMs into security as your security center, or Defender as your Defender. But it's one of those things where a lot of the when people sort of turn that into a slightly different question and say, when will Windows Server support Intune? Well, it actually used to, but it wasn't the Intune that anyone is using today, because it was agent-based and you could install it onto Windows Server, but it technically wasn't supported. But when you think about MDM, the use cases for Windows Server being managed by MDM kind of fall apart really, really quickly, especially with the way it works with identity with Azure AD versus AD itself. Moving forward, and this is one of the reasons why group policy isn't going to go away. Even people who are moving whatever VMs they've got, Windows Server VMs they've got into Azure or AWS or whatever, they'll still more than likely be using GPO on those VMs anyway. Maybe they're relying on it less than they used to, but it's still something that they'll be getting recommendations around what they should be doing with system hardening anyway, and most of that is going to be GPO focused.
So kind of touch on that and go back to the previous one. I always used to say about Configuration Manager, the problem with it is to administer it, you kind of need to know about everything that's attaching to it, which is everything. And the truth is set of Intune is you kind of need to know about all the bits that are connecting to it. So when you start talking about where's a good place to start, you just have to pick a spot. Some of the MD, like MD 100, MD 101 exams are really good spots to start there to get a feeling from the Microsoft side of things as to why they're doing what they're doing. And then from that, if you start talking about not having servers supported, well, that's why Configuration Manager is part of MEM, Microsoft Endpoint Configuration Manager now. And it starts the conversation and the road mapping towards Azure Active Directory as a service, which doesn't support a lot of the things that on-premise AD does. And then people need to start thinking about how they can get their server environment in Azure or wherever to support something like that where Intune is heavily integrated.
Yeah, and I don't want to delve too far down the identity path because it's a really slippery slope for me to go down there really easy because that's me. Like I'm an identity guy, and so as soon as we start mentioning AAD, I'll start going in a very different direction. When we, I guess part of this was kind of having that notes from the field type thing as well. Like, what are some of the real things that, and I guess I asked this before, is what can go wrong, not what can go wrong, but what do you need to make sure you get right? And I guess what we've heard is document the hell out of everything, right? And then understand where your is that where you start going into a gap analysis between well, we've got X, Y, and Z through group policy and SCCM, and what does that translate to into an Intune world? And then start breaking out those machines from the traditional on-prem management and moving them into a cloud management?
I would suggest that a better approach is to look at a deliverable for the business, not a deliverable for the IT department. All this talk about the policy just makes all the IT people, run around and have lots of bad nightmares. I think you need to look at what's a deliverable we can give to the business with this implementation so that if things are rocky, if things are challenging, this is the reason why we're doing it. So I would suggest that a lot of businesses now are focused on, conforming to the Essential 8, the NIST, the CISA, whatever. So one of those components, as an example, might be things like application whitelisting. That is something that is capable of being done with this environment. So maybe you say, we are going to deliver application whitelisting and we're going to use Intune and Endpoint Manager to deliver it. That is going to tick a number of boxes for us, and then we'll scroll from there. So my advice would be is don't focus on, yes, we want to connect devices to Azure AD and cause all these issues for the customer, because that is no value to the customer in their minds. Whereas if you say we're going to do application whitelisting, which is part of the Essential 8, which improves our security to the next level, there's a reason to do all those other options.
So just to touch on that, if you're an IT pro and you've got a burning desire to move everything to Intune and you've got all these, I want to play with the new tech, and my apologies, I've got a 6-year-old and 11-year-old fighting in the background. How do you do the trend? Like and I'm asking as the dumb question. Where do you start with doing the translation into business case for that? Like, what do you guys find is like the top 5 business reasons to actually move to Intune or to implement Intune, whether that be MDM or a migration into
security
hybrid?
Yeah,
security.
Yeah, security as well. Yeah, so I guess more specifically, the security of remote devices would be and I'm not sure, I'm pretty sure that's probably what Rob meant more, more implicitly, but it's that, it's knowing the devices are secure, getting the reporting on them, etc., which generally, if they're your traditional on-prem machine and that person, normally VPNs, but they haven't done it for however many weeks or months, it's that additional insight and knowing that policy updates are getting pushed out.
Can I quickly jump in here?
Yeah.
Because you're saying reporting, one of the things I struggle with is getting the right reports. Like we had the what's it called? With Endpoint Protector, with Endpoint Manager, you can use the reporting into Azure, but that's not supported on an Azure AD only joint only device. So where do you see that coming in from?
So my advice to you would be is there are a number of different options depending on what level you want to go to. The ultimate is the connection to something like Power BI, which there is the interface to do that. The next option is to look at integration with things like log analytics, and there are options around the Microsoft Graph, and worst case worst, you can export them and create the reports yourself. So there are lots of options in there, but the ultimate, before Microsoft does roll out what it has planned, and it will improve it, I think, is basically the integration with Power BI to at least get the data into a lake that you can then slice and dice the way you want it. My preferred option is generally to go to log analytics. It provides a more capable platform to produce the information that you want.
So on the reporting piece, and we touched on Power BI and all those sort of things, there is obviously the data warehousing Microsoft pre-built Power BI dashboard in there. Is there anything else that people should be looking at from outside of the basics of, we've touched on all the management stuff. There's the reporting stuff as well, which is always huge when it comes to endpoint management, whether that be mobile or Windows/Mac/Linux, or, well, let's not talk about Linux. But so the reporting side of that, where do people really need to get? Where's the chops that they need on that? Is it Power BI? Is it Flow as well? Where's the extra bits there?
I think it largely depends on the individual and how advanced or how comfortable they are moving to a DevOps world rather than a pure IT environment. So the more comfortable you are with software and analysis and spreadsheets and Power Pivot, the more likely you are to be comfortable moving into Power BI and all those sort of things. However, I would suggest to you that you need to develop the skills around, things like KQL, the queries, the ability to use log analytics and Power BI and Power Automate that are in this environment to fill in the gaps, as we've always done with Excel macros and PowerShell scripts and so on, to provide the information that you want. So I think rather than looking at it as what can we produce, I think you look at it at the other end as what do I actually want? Why is it important for me to know that I've got 10 Windows 10 machines? I already know that. That's irrelevant. Yes, it's a nice green thing I can point to, but it's largely irrelevant. I think you've got to look at it and say, what information gives me what I need to, rather than just filling up my eyeballs with stuff which is largely irrelevant and doesn't add business value.
And that just comes back to the same thing over and over again. And it is the reoccurring theme, which is stop talking tech, start talking business. It is get the business requirement. Why are we doing this? Not we're doing it because we're doing it. It's the business need.
And I think just quickly, for me, one of the best examples of this is Azure Sentinel, right? To me, Azure Sentinel is the bottom of the funnel that I can look at every day, and it tells me whether I need to worry and go in any more drilling. I'm not going to look at low-level device reports. I'm not going to look at low-level patching reports. I'm going to allow the machine, the artificial intelligence, Microsoft's analysis, KQL rules to tell me, do I have to worry about this? So I think that you need to look at the signals that you're obtaining from your devices and endpoint manager. That should not be your end management, analysis, monitoring tool. I would suggest you need to push it into another tool that provides this aggregation using things like machine learning and artificial intelligence to allow you to get on with the job you're paid to do, rather than just going through 95% of the false positives which come from low-level alert.
Yeah, so, and probably one of the gotchas to watch out for, if this probably really only applies to, I guess in this conversation, to people who manage Config Manager, is because Config Manager's got it, underlying it, there's SQL Server, you've got your SQL Server reporting services in there. There's a lot of flexibility that you get with Config Manager on-prem in terms of just creating whatever reports you want using technologies you've been using for years or potentially decades. And if you are sort of thrown from that environment into Intune, where it's a whole set of different tools, different technologies, et cetera, that you have to use, that can be quite a shock for people who might, their initial response is going to be, I thought the cloud was supposed to do all of this stuff automatically for us. And it's like, I don't think anyone ever said that. maybe you assumed that was the case. So this is one of the things where, sometimes, when you move to cloud, maybe you're not necessarily going to get as much insight by default across every single thing that you may have been looking at on-prem over the years. It doesn't mean you can't get that information. It just means that, using some of the solutions that Rob just mentioned, you might need to get a bit more creative in terms of how do you pull it out. And it also just sort of ties into one of the things where this, and what Rob, all the different pieces that Rob just mentioned, just confirms what I was saying about you can't have an Intune conversation. You have to have an Intune as part of the overall solution conversation. Because if someone said, Config Manager does all of this for me, it's like, well, Config Manager is using SQL and all these other bits to get some of that stuff done. And you've got to look at Intune the same way. That it's on its, so if someone's just trying to look at it on a feature list of Intune itself, there's going to be a ton of things it doesn't do because it's not designed to do those things. So you have to sort of look at it in combination with, whether it's integrating other Azure services or other M365 services. So that's just a little thing to watch out for, where, the number of times I've had someone say, Intune doesn't do this, 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 and this. And I'd say, well, of course it doesn't. None of those are application management or device management related features. Whereas, and I guess where this also comes into play is if somebody's worked with MSP software that's tried to be everything for everyone in terms of, managing remote Windows PCs, etc. You go to an MDM solution and it's very, very different because it's not targeting something via an agent the same way.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it as well. And we keep coming back to this point of it's a well, I mean, as my dad used to say, the 6 Ps, which is proper planning prevents a pretty poor performance. I won't use that. It's actually a piss poor performance. But it's getting all your understanding what the product does, understanding that what you're doing now, and the translation to what it can do. Once you've got the understanding, and that's always the second part. The first part's, what do you actually want to do? What do you want to deliver to the business with this? What's the core requirement, business requirements that you're trying to tick off at each point of your project delivery to make sure that your stakeholders, your managers, everyone else is going, okay, and Robert, I think you said it perfectly, was we're wearing this pain because we want to get to X, which makes it really easy for a business to be able to say, we're doing these things because of this. When, no IT project ever goes perfectly. You're always going to have something go not quite to plan. But when it does, it makes it a lot easier to be able to, push back when the natives are restless and they're coming at you with pitchforks and torches, that we're doing this to get to an endpoint that we know is going to make us it's going to be better for the users, better for the organization, and here's the reasons why. We're in a more secure position. We're in we're going to have better usability. We're going to have more flexibility. We're going to be able to give you, the user, the option to be able to work remotely more effectively and stuff like that. On the and to take it back a bit more on the onboarding piece, I guess the tips and tricks and notes from the field side of that as well. Is there anything that can go, I guess, go wrong with this? Every environment's different. We're not going to be able to cover, you know, what it looks like for absolutely any possible environmental variable. But what are some of the things that you guys have seen in your travels for this kind of thing to look out for?
Let me just jump in, because I do have to head off in a couple of minutes. So an example of it is for example, one of the things that you can enable with Endpoint Manager and Intune is virtualization-based security. So basically setting up a Hyper-V machine on the machine so it can sandbox things like the browser and your Office applications. Really, really good security. But generally, it means enabling something in the settings for Windows, which will force all the machines to reboot, and the users will get a nice little warning saying your machine's going to reboot in 10 minutes. So you've got to be careful about some of the application of policy that will require or force reboots of machines. Now, they're few and far between. But for example, you know, virtualization-based security will require a reboot so the hypervisor can be loaded. So typically that's what we see. Another one I've got that I'll give you is things like Microsoft's policies largely want to enforce, you know, BitLocker everywhere, including USB drives, and that can be very frustrating for users who get a message about having to encrypt or not being able to read USB keys that need to be BitLocker enabled. So again, I think you've just got to, and that is obviously an important security thing to have if that is part of your organizational governance. So it's typically those sort of things where you're going to potentially lock a user out or force a reboot. And the last thing that I'll say before I head off is my advice to you is to strongly make sure you have at least one break glass account, which is an admin account not subject to any Intune or conditional access policies, because if it all turns to poo, then you can at least log in with that account and roll back any of the settings. Some of the worst thing you can do is click yes on a policy, realize that the admin account is part of that policy, and lock the admin out from making any changes. So they're the last ones that I'll leave you with before I do duck out. Thank everybody for your opportunity to share my thoughts. And again, keep going. Don't let me stop you. And if you do have any questions, you can hit me up if you need to. So thanks to everybody.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Robert.
Thank you. Yeah, look, the break glass account from a best practices point of view, it's not even a best practices thing. I don't think it's just you have to do this, and make sure it sounds weird. Exclude it from your MFA policy. Exclude it from your Intune policies. Exclude it from your policies in the cloud, because and I guess the other part of that from the security point of view is if that is a privileged account, which it more than likely will be a GA account, and if it isn't, it probably should be as well, is that you are monitoring the use of that account, so that when that account logs in, there's literally red lights and sirens going off somewhere in your organization to make sure that someone knows that that account's been used, and that you start looking at the location of where and why, and potentially start making some phone calls and get ready to lock that account down.
Just got a hand up here from David Nichols.
Yeah, look, I came in a bit late. Apologies for that. I had something else happening to me. With regards to the baseline policies, I've done a few of these. I think in a 3-day period, I pushed baselines to about 38 tenants. Rather interesting experience, but anyway, I didn't tell the clients I was doing it either, so that made it a little bit more interesting when I had to troubleshoot a couple of things. But I knew the tenants intimately, and I knew I wasn't going to see too many things. But if you're doing these baselines, I would just say target some test machines.
Yeah.
Can't stress it enough.
Yeah,
and
they break funny things, don't they?
Try every single app that they have to use on those machines, and you'll see some things like it'll lock down little things. It'll lock down the Windows firewall so they can't walk up to their multifunction center and scan and choose their machine off the screen, right? Because the firewall's going to block that now. So it'll do things like that. It'll also do, well, if anyone's silly enough to be using Internet Explorer, some apps still require it, and it's going to turn a whole bunch of that stuff off. But you've just got to be ready for it. Some of the downloading and installing some unsigned apps that are line of business apps and essential for some businesses, they'll get blocked by Defender for Endpoint and a few other things. So just try it, test it, but do it on a targeted, narrow base first. So that's all I have to say there.
Like even something that should be, that you'd think wouldn't be that problematic, like controlled folder access. Turning that on can cause chaos. Like every time I've seen people turn it on without running it in audit for an incredibly long, monitoring period, they're like, oh, all these things that users didn't use during the first 3 days. It's like, yeah, really.
I just haven't been brave enough to do that, Mark.
Yeah, like oh no, that is one that like every now and then, like I think I've nailed it, and then some random thing that I trust wants to write to one of those folders.
On that topic, I've heard Robert, who's probably left now, I've heard him speak on that before, and his comment on that to me was controlled folder access is easier in the enterprise where you have a lot more control over apps, but in SMB, it's really tough because there's you see a business with 10 to 20 people in it, and there's all sorts of extremes of differences of users.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
at least in a larger org, you could target different policies, whereas in a smaller org, you're not going to build out, a policy to target 2 users or 3 users or something like that. That's just creating more of a headache for you.
I know, but sometimes you've got to.
Oh, yeah.
I know it's a beautiful thing when you get somebody who grabs a machine out of the box and they open it up and it hits the internet and autopilot takes over and everything happens and all your apps and things install automatically and you don't have to touch it. It's a beautiful thing. So anyway.
Yeah. I think we are quickly running out of time. I'm going to do a bit of a sum up of the things that we've talked about, and I guess we'll go round the grounds for just some closing thoughts as well, just on these topics. The things that I've taken away from this are that I shouldn't let 2 boys into my office when I'm doing a call, especially ones that are recorded and are going to be publicly available. Other than that, it's that do your due diligence on your current environment, and don't just do it around your SCCM environment. Make sure you've got your SCCM environment, your AD, your group policies, and include your cloud footprint as well. So your Azure AD, and make sure you're comfortable with Azure AD and conditional access as well. And that you're understanding where your potential gaps are going to be, and what the product is, not looking at it necessarily from a feature point of view as a, hey, Intune can't do this, it must be crap. It's a, what does it do well, and let's play to its strengths. Understanding that servers are going to be different beasts, and you shouldn't be trying to shoehorn them into that. And that also you should be starting with the business drivers behind this. So make sure you've got your business drivers clearly aligned to what your technology outcomes are going to be, and that your technology outcomes aren't driving your business outcomes. Your business outcomes and deliverables should be defined by the business and your stakeholders, your managers, your people like that, and then you align your technology through to that. Understanding that MDM is probably a really great place to start with, and will get you some really quick wins across, especially from a security point of view as well. I'm sure I've missed a whole heap of stuff because we've talked about a lot of stuff. I guess, is there anything else that you guys want to leave the lovely people with before we depart shortly?
Start small. So, whether it's just a test project that you've got, whether it's a small group of users that you basically have identified a business requirement, but try, do the good old, under promise and over deliver. And if you're already working with Intune, you probably don't realize how much you already know And this is something that it's not just Intune these days, but people who are sort of coming into some of these cloud technologies today, there's positives and negatives for them. The positive is that the functionality is a lot better than it used to be, and there's so much good documentation available these days. But the downside is that, there's, all of those additional features do introduce complexity. Like going back 5 or 6 years ago, maybe, like I could have sat you down in 3 hours and showed you probably 95% of what Intune could do. Whereas now if somebody says to me, oh, have you tested this thing in Intune? It's like, nope, I've never had a project that's required that. Thank you for asking. And they're like, oh, could you find out anything about it for me? And it's like, when I have a project that requires me to learn about it, I will invest time in it. So, so while there definitely are people who work with Intune all day, every day, I think most of them would, even if other people are sort of hailing them as Intune experts, those people will probably go, hang on, I've never looked at these entire sections of things. And that's why it's important to start small. Like if you're going to be doing MDM, maybe target one OS before you try to target all OSs. And I guess, even there, like things like, on the Android side, if you can use work profiles in Android, rather than enrolling Android devices as MDM devices, that's going to be a much better option there. Whereas iOS, you're stuck with MDM for now.
Sort of with iOS, that was one of the things I was going to touch on very briefly, is the thing that catches people out is they expect iOS to be managed or supervised, as they call it, fully straight from the get-go. But the reality is, unless you're utilising the device enrollment program through Apple, then tough luck.
Cool. We are running a bit over, a lot over what we kind of had put in to begin with. Andrew, was there anything from you wanted to? Is there anything you want to cover off?
Yeah, I guess to sum it up, sounds like it's not a one person's job. It's you kind of need like a team of people to be across, all the different parts, all different workloads. I mean, I reach out to the tech community. Mark, I've hit up in DMs very often just for some help. So we're all here to help each other out. So yeah, if it's not in the documentation, someone may have gone through it before.
And because you open. Sorry, go, Bill. Go.
I was just going to say, just remember that Intune is the love child of SCCM, so sometimes it will just do weird things that you can't really explain. That's just part of it. Get used to it.
Okay, and mine was just going to be, because we started off with Ninja Cat, an early iteration of Ninja Cat. I just thought I'd sort of bring up Ninja Cat today, complete with the
very nice.
The tattoo on the back. I was about to say what those tattoos are called, but I realised I probably shouldn't. It's a postage stamp.
Postage stamp. Proof of ownership?
Yeah.
That's a brand, isn't it? Cool. So I don't know, have you guys touched on any of the Windows 365 stuff yet in Intune?
No.
No. That might be a next topic.
Oh, I've seen that there's a baseline policy for it, and I'm hoping that will allow me to do some things like turn on and off the ability to copy out of the clipboard and things like that, so that it can become maybe a closed environment, because I've got some clients who would really like it to be a closed environment. It's too new. I haven't had a chance to have a good play with it yet. So
yeah, did you guys have any other things to add? Otherwise, we'll close out the main presentation, and people can stick around for maybe a couple of minutes if there's any extra questions.
I guess just thanks for the invite. It's almost like seeing people in person. In however many weeks of lockdown we've been in Sydney at the moment.
Yeah, we'll send you some virtual bin chickens.
Yeah. I was going to bring one in, but I thought I'd bring the Ninja Cat in instead.
Yeah.
Oh, it's pretty quiet in Melbourne at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's
CBD is like a ghost town.
yeah. So I can almost drive to the Opera House and the bridge. So I can almost get down to the touristy parts of Sydney, and I can almost get to the airport. Not that I could go anywhere if I got there, because we've got our 5 kilometre radius travel thing as well.
Yeah. They lifted ours to 15, but there's nothing. I'm 26 k's from the city.
So going to 15 means you've got a few extra supermarkets that you can get to.
Yeah, yeah. And it puts a grandson within reach, but that's about it. We can't go and visit him in his house.
Yeah.
So, anyway. Gentlemen, it was good, even though I missed it, came in a bit late, but I'll catch up with a bit on the recording. So.
Yep. All right.
All right.
Okay then.
Thanks,
Good to see
guys.
you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Chat later.
Thanks, guys.